Welcome to the channel, Final Curiosity. From 1854 comes today's story, Gideon Vance. A black boy who painted as if he were Leonardo da Vinci. It could be explained by no one. No teacher, no master, no record. This story is a heavy one. Take a breath. Listen with care. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments the city and country you are listening from. Your presence is what keeps these stories alive. Instead of letting them be forgotten, let us begin. In Charleston, South Carolina, during the summer of 1854, something occurred that no historian has ever fully been able to explain. On June 17th of that year, inside the grand ballroom of the Planters Hotel on Meeting Street, gathered over 200 of the American South's most powerful people, for what they believed was to be a celebration. In their finest clothes they came. Tailored suits imported from London were worn by the men. Silk gowns costing more than most families, earned in a year, were worn by the women. They drank French champagne and ate oysters brought fresh from the coast that very morning. They were there to honor a young white man of just 24 years, Thomas Ashworth, who had become the most celebrated painter in the entire South. But by that night's end, every single person in that room would witness something they could not unsee, a revelation so shocking that newspapers from Richmond to New Orleans would carry the story on their front pages. A truth so uncomfortable that powerful men would spend years trying to bury it. And at the center of it all was not Thomas Ashworth, but a 17-year-old enslaved boy whose name most of those guests had never heard spoken aloud. Gideon was his name, and this is his story. To understand what happened in Charleston that night, we need to go back 14 years, to a cotton plantation 43 miles northwest of the city. The Ashworth plantation covered nearly 3,000 acres of prime Carolina low country. In 1840, it was home to 112 enslaved people who worked the fields from before sunrise until after dark. The plantation was owned by a man named Cornelius Ashworth, a third-generation planter, whose family had grown wealthy from cotton and rice. Throughout the county, Cornelius was known as a hard man. Not cruel in the theatrical way some slaveholders were, but cold and calculating. The people he owned he saw as investments, nothing more. Their births and deaths he tracked in the same leather ledger, where he recorded the purchase of new plows and the sale of cotton bales. In March of 1840, an enslaved woman named Ruth went into labor in one of the small wooden cabins lining the dirt path behind the big house. Ruth was 22 years old. She had been purchased by the Ashworth family when she was just 12, brought to the plantation from a slave market in Savannah. In the 10 years since, she had worked in the fields, then in the kitchen, and finally in the laundry. For her quiet strength and her ability to endure whatever was placed upon her shoulders, she was known. The labor was difficult, lasting almost 18 hours. What they could for her the other women in the quarters did, but there was no doctor, no medicine, no help beyond what their own hands and knowledge could provide. Just before dawn on March 14th, Ruth gave birth to a baby boy. Small but alive, he came into the world, his lungs strong enough to cry out into the cold morning air. For less than an hour, Ruth held her son. She named him Gideon, after a figure from the Bible she had learned about from the plantation's Sunday services. Then, the bleeding that had started during the birth would not stop. By the time the sun rose fully over the Carolina pines, Ruth was gone. The baby Gideon was taken in by an older woman named Cora, who had already raised 6 children of her own on that plantation, 4 of whom had been sold away to other states. With milk from a rag, Cora fed the infant and kept him alive through those first fragile weeks. She would later tell others that from the very beginning, something about this child was different. He rarely cried. With eyes that seemed too old for his small face, he watched everything. and when he was old enough to hold a stick, he began to draw. Gideon's father was a man named Solomon who had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi just 2 months before Gideon was born. That he had a son Solomon never knew. In 1847, he died of fever without ever learning that Ruth had been pregnant. This was a common tragedy in the world of American slavery. Families torn apart. Children growing up without ever knowing who their parents were. An entire system designed to break the bonds that hold people together. By the time Gideon was 5 years old, he was already working. This was normal for enslaved children on southern plantations. They were put to work as soon as they were physically able. Gideon's first job was to carry water to the field workers. A wooden bucket in each hand, he would walk back and forth from the well to the fields, all day long in the Carolina heat. By the time he was 7, he was assigned to the stables where he cleaned stalls, fed horses, and learned to make himself invisible. But at night, when his work was done, and the overseers had gone back to their quarters, Gideon would find pieces of charred wood from the cooking fires. These pieces of charcoal he would take to a spot behind the old smokehouse where no one ever went. And there, on scraps of wood, on flat stones, on anything he could find, Gideon would draw. The things he saw around him he drew. The faces of the people in the quarters, the horses in the stable, the big house with its white columns, the oak trees with their hanging moss. From memory he drew, and from imagination. And even though he had never been taught, even though he had never seen a real painting or met anyone who called themselves an artist, the images he created were remarkable. One evening in the spring of 1848, when Gideon was 8 years old, an old man named Ezekiel found the boy drawing behind the smokehouse. Ezekiel was in his 70s, one of the oldest enslaved people on the plantation. He had been born in Africa and brought to America on a slave ship when he was a young man. Things in his life that he rarely spoke about he had seen, but when he saw what Gideon was doing, he stood very still for a long time. The drawing was of a woman's face. It was Ruth. Gideon had never seen his mother, but Korah had described her to him many times. The shape of her eyes, the way she smiled, the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. These descriptions Gideon had taken and turned into an image so lifelike that Ezekiel felt his heart stop. He had known Ruth. He had been there the night she died. And looking at that drawing was like seeing her ghost. Ezekiel knelt down beside the boy. Carefully he spoke, knowing that what he was about to say was important. What he could do was a gift, he told Gideon, but he also told him that it was a dangerous gift. White folks, Ezekiel said, did not like to see black people do things they were not supposed to be able to do. If the master found out about these drawings, there was no telling what might happen. Ezekiel made Gideon promise to be careful, to keep his gift hidden, to only draw when he was sure no one was watching. Gideon promised, and for the next 3 years, he kept that promise. In secret he continued to draw, improving with each passing month. New materials to work with he found. Berry juice for color, clay mixed with water for different shades of brown. With everything he could get his hands on he experimented. And with each experiment, his abilities grew. Meanwhile, life on the Ashworth plantation continued as it always had. With coal deficiency, Cornelius Ashworth ran his operation. Cotton prices were good in the early 1850s, and the plantation was profitable. Cornelius had 2 children, a daughter named Elizabeth, who was married to a lawyer in Charleston, and a son named Thomas, who was 20 years old in 1850 and had recently returned from 3 years of schooling in Boston. Thomas Ashworth was not like his father. Where Cornelius was practical and focused on business, Thomas was interested in art and culture. His years in Boston he had spent attending lectures, visiting galleries, and trying to develop himself as a painter. Some talent he had, the kind that comes from good instruction and expensive supplies. But deep down, Thomas knew he would never be great. The technique he had, but not the spark. Competent but lifeless were his paintings. They looked like copies of better work. This frustrated Thomas deeply. He had grown up being told he was special, that he was better than other people, simply because of who his family was. The discovery that talent does not care about bloodlines or bank accounts was a bitter pill. To South Carolina, Thomas returned with a chip on his shoulder and something dark growing in his heart. In the fall of 1851, something happened that would change everything. Thomas was walking near the old smokehouse one evening when he heard a sound. It was quiet, just a soft scratching noise, but it caught his attention. Around the back of the building, he followed the sound, pushing through the overgrown weeds. And there he found Gideon. The boy was 11 years old now. Sitting on an overturned bucket, he was, focused completely on what he was doing. In front of him was a large flat piece of pine bark, and on that bark was an image that stopped Thomas in his tracks. It was a landscape of the plantation at sunset. Visible in the distance was the big house, with the fields stretching out before it. The sky was rendered in shades of orange and purple that Thomas had never been able to achieve in his own work. Exactly right felt the shadows. Perfect was the perspective. And there was something else, something harder to define. The painting had feeling. It had life. Looking at it was like looking through a window at the real thing. Thomas did not speak. He could not speak. For a long moment, he just stood there, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. This was not possible. This child, this enslaved boy who had never seen the inside of an art gallery, who had never held a proper brush or studied with a master, was producing work that was better than anything Thomas had ever created. When he realized he was not alone, Gideon had frozen. He knew he was caught. Punishment he expected. He expected to be beaten or sold or worse. He had broken the unspoken rule of the plantation. He had revealed that he was more than what they said he was. But Thomas did not call for the overseer. He did not raise his voice or his hand. Instead, he knelt down and looked at the painting more closely. Questions he asked. How long had Gideon been doing this? Where did he learn? Had anyone taught him? Truthfully, Gideon answered. Since he was old enough to hold a stick, he had been drawing. No one had taught him. Things in his mind he just saw and put them down on whatever surface he could find. Why or how he did not know. It was just something he could do. Slowly Thomas stood up. His mind was working now, calculating in a way he had learned from his father. An opportunity he saw, a dark and twisted opportunity, but an opportunity nonetheless. He told Gideon that he would not report what he had found. His secret was safe, he told the boy, but there was a condition. From now on, Gideon would work for Thomas. Paintings that Thomas would claim as his own he would create. In return, Gideon would be protected. Better food, better clothes he would be given, and he would not be sold away from the plantation. Gideon was 11 years old. He had no power, no rights, no one to protect him. Even at that young age he understood what was being offered. It was not freedom. It was a different kind of cage. But it was a cage that might keep him alive, that might keep him close to Cora and the few people he cared about. He agreed. What choice did he have? And so began one of the strangest and most hidden chapters in American art history. For the next 3 years, Gideon would create paintings in secret for Thomas Ashworth. In a small room in the basement of the big house he worked, a space that had once been used for storage. Real supplies Thomas brought him. Canvas, brushes, oils imported from Europe, books with reproductions of great paintings he brought him so Gideon could study the techniques of the masters. Everything a young artist would need to develop their craft he brought him. And quickly Gideon learned. Within months, he had mastered techniques that took most artists years to develop. Light and shadow instinctively he understood. The human face he could capture with a depth and emotion that made viewers feel they knew the subject personally. His landscapes seemed to breathe. Good enough to eat looked his still leaves. These paintings Thomas took and presented as his own work. To his father first he showed them, who was pleased to see his son finally succeeding at something. Then to family, friends, and neighbors he showed them. Through the county word began to spread about young Thomas Ashworth's remarkable talent. To see his work people came to the plantation, portraits and landscapes they commissioned. Good money they paid for paintings that Thomas had not touched except to sign his name. By 1853, Thomas Ashworth was the most talked about painter in South Carolina. A prodigy, critics in Charleston called him. Glowing reviews newspapers published. To exhibit his work in galleries he was invited where the wealthy and powerful came to admire and purchase. The truth no one suspected. Why would they? The idea that an enslaved child could produce such sophisticated art was unthinkable to them. Their entire worldview was built on the belief that black people were inferior, incapable of higher thought or refined creativity. Proof that this belief was wrong should have been the paintings in front of their eyes. But the possibility they never even considered. From the shadows Gideon watched all of this. He was not allowed to attend the exhibitions. He was not mentioned in the reviews. When wealthy visitors came to the plantation to meet the famous young artist, Gideon was kept out of sight, locked in the basement, or sent to work in the far fields. His existence was a secret that Thomas guarded carefully. But secrets have a way of creating pressure, and the pressure was building inside Gideon. Every painting he created was a piece of his soul that he was forced to give away. Portraits of men who owned other human beings he painted. Landscapes of plantations where people like him worked until they died he painted. Scenes of a world that treated him as property while it celebrated his work he painted. And every time, Thomas signed his name to one of these paintings. Something inside Gideon twisted a little tighter. Other costs as well the arrangement had. Protection Thomas had promised, but his promise had conditions. If Gideon refused to paint, or if his work was not good enough, Thomas reminded him of what could happen. A younger girl in the quarters there was named Mercy. She was 7 years old, the daughter of a woman who had been sold away 2 years earlier. Under his care Gideon had taken the girl, treating her like the little sister he had never had. To read using marks in the dirt he taught her, just as Cora had once taught him. That she ate enough he made sure. From the older boys who sometimes caused trouble he protected her. About Mercy Thomas knew. He knew that she was the one person Gideon cared about more than himself. And this knowledge as a weapon he used. If Gideon ever disobeyed, if he ever told anyone the truth, Mercy would be the first to suffer. To the worst plantation he could find, Thomas would make sure she was sold, somewhere deep in the Mississippi Delta, where conditions were known to be brutal. This threat in detail he described, making sure Gideon understood exactly what was at stake. So Gideon painted. With fear in his heart and chains on his soul he painted. And with each painting his hatred grew. In the spring of 1854, a new figure arrived in the county. Ezra Finch was his name, and as a traveling salesman of art supplies, he presented himself. A thin man in his 40s with spectacles, and a gentle manner he was. Throughout the region he visited plantations and wealthy homes, selling brushes, pigments, canvases, and other materials. Harmless he seemed, just another businessman trying to make a living. But not what he appeared to be was Ezra Finch. A member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society he was, and his art supply business was a cover for his real work, gathering information about the conditions of enslaved people and helping to organize escapes through the Underground Railroad. About Thomas Ashworth's remarkable paintings Ezra had heard. Even in the North, the work had attracted attention, where critics were impressed by the technical skill on display. Curious Ezra was. To the Ashworth plantation in April of 1854, he made his way, carrying cases of supplies and a letter of introduction from a merchant in Charleston. Warmly, Thomas received him. He was always happy to meet someone who appreciated art. And for his latest commission he needed supplies, a large historical painting that had been ordered by the governor of South Carolina himself. At a special ceremony in June it was to be unveiled, a celebration of Southern culture and achievement. The scene in his mind Thomas had already planned out. It would be his masterpiece, the painting that would cement his reputation forever. Of course, Gideon would be the one to actually create it. Several days at the plantation Ezra spent, observing everything he could. He noticed the way Thomas talked about his work without ever mentioning the actual process of creation. He noticed the lack of paint stains on Thomas's hands, the absence of the telltale signs that mark a working artist. He noticed the way certain areas of the big house were kept off limits to visitors. And he noticed a young black boy who appeared briefly one evening carrying supplies from a basement door to a storage area. Something about the boy caught Ezra's attention. It was the way he moved, the way he looked at the world around him, an intensity in his eyes. There was that did not match his lowered head and shuffling steps. That look before in people who were hiding something important Ezra had seen. One evening, Ezra excused himself from dinner early, claiming a headache. Instead of going to his room, through the house he made his way quietly to the basement stairs. Slowly he moved, careful not to make any sound. At the bottom of the stairs, a door slightly ajar he found. Warm light from inside spilled out. The door open he pushed and stepped into a small room that had been converted into an artist's studio. Against the walls canvases were stacked. Shelves filled with pigments and oils there were. In the center of the room an easel was where a large painting was taking shape, and standing before that easel, brush in hand, was the boy he had seen earlier. When he heard the door, Gideon spun around. With terror his eyes went wide. The brush he dropped, and for a moment both of them stood frozen, staring at each other across the cramped space. Slowly Ezra raised his hands, showing that he meant no harm. In a low voice he spoke, calm and steady. He told Gideon that he was not going to hurt him. He was not going to tell anyone what he had seen. He just wanted to understand. A long time it took for Gideon to speak. 3 years of secrecy and fear had taught him to trust no one. But something in Ezra's manner there was that was different from the white men Gideon had known. No condescension there was, no hidden cruelty. Only curiosity there was, and something that looked almost like respect. Slowly, carefully, the story came out. Everything Gideon told Ezra. The drawings behind the smokehouse. Thomas finding him. The arrangement that had trapped him for 3 years. The threats against mercy. The hundreds of hours spent creating paintings that would bear another man's name. When Gideon finished, for a long moment Ezra was silent. At the painting on the easel he looked, a landscape that captured the light of early morning with breathtaking accuracy. At the stacks of canvases he looked, each one representing hours of skilled labor by a child who received no credit and no compensation. At Gideon he looked, a 17-year-old boy who had been robbed of everything except his talent. Then a decision Ezra made that would set in motion the events of that night in Charleston. About the Underground Railroad, he told Gideon. He explained that there were people throughout the South who helped enslaved people escape to freedom in the North and in Canada. That he could help Gideon and Mercy get out, he said, could arrange for them to be taken to Philadelphia, where as free people they could start new lives. Carefully Gideon listened, but when Ezra finished, he shook his head. Running away was not enough. If he disappeared, Thomas would continue to use the paintings that had already been created. Credit for work that was not his he would continue to claim. No consequences for what he had done he would face. Never known would the truth be. About this for a long time Gideon had been thinking. In the lonely hours he spent in that basement studio, over and over on the injustice of his situation his mind had turned. Of revenge he had dreamed, of finding some way to expose Thomas for the fraud he was, but a way to do it safely he had never seen. Now, with Ezra's help, a plan began to form. The governor's commission was the key. It would be the most important painting of Thomas's career, unveiled at a ceremony attended by the most powerful people in the South. All eyes would be on that painting. If there was ever a moment to reveal the truth, that was it. What he wanted to do, Gideon told Ezra. The painting that Thomas had promised the governor he would create. But it would not be the painting Thomas expected. Something else entirely it would be. A testament to the truth it would be, a visual confession that could not be denied or explained away. The fire in Gideon's eyes Ezra saw. He understood that this young man had been pushed beyond the limits of what any person should have to endure. The desire for justice that burned in him, he understood. And after a long conversation that lasted until the early hours of the morning, to help Ezra agreed. Over the next 2 months, the plan took shape. 2 paintings Gideon would create. The first was the one Thomas had ordered, a grand historical scene depicting the founding of Charleston. On this painting openly Gideon worked, letting Thomas see his progress, keeping him satisfied and unsuspecting. The second painting was created in secret. Late at night after Thomas had gone to sleep, Gideon worked on it. Behind the larger canvas he hid it, covering it with cloth, whenever he heard footsteps approaching. Different from anything he had ever created before was this painting. Beautiful in the traditional sense it was not. Not the kind of art that wealthy people hung in their parlors it was. A statement it was, a declaration, a weapon made of paint and canvas. The centerpiece of the painting was a self-portrait. Never before had Gideon painted himself. Such a thing Thomas had never asked for. And on his own Gideon had never thought to create one. But now before a small mirror that Ezra had smuggled into the studio, he stood and studied his own face for the first time as an artist studies a subject. What he saw surprised him. A victim he had expected to see, a boy broken by years of servitude and exploitation. But the face that looked back at him was strong. Fierce were the eyes. A power there was that years of bondage had not been able to destroy. That power he painted. Not as a slave he painted himself, but as an artist, a creator, a human being with dignity and worth. Like a sword he held a brush in one hand. Behind him flames consumed a plantation that looked very much like the Ashworth estate, and scattered throughout the painting, hidden in the details, were the faces of everyone Gideon had known in his 17 years of life. Cora, who had raised him. Ezekiel, who had warned him. Ruth, his mother, reconstructed from Cora's descriptions in his own imagination. Mercy, the little girl he had sworn to protect. In the corner of the painting, clearly visible, was a signature. Gideon, not Thomas Ashworth. Gideon. A single word that would tell the world everything. As June approached, the preparations for the governor's ceremony intensified. With social obligations, Thomas was busy, attending parties and giving interviews about his upcoming masterpiece. The basement studio less frequently he visited, trusting that Gideon would complete the work as ordered. This gave Gideon more time to work on his secret painting, adding layers of meaning and detail that would only become clear upon close examination. Weeks earlier, Ezra Finch had left the plantation, but through a network of trusted allies, he remained in contact. For several members of the Underground Railroad to be present in Charleston on the night of the ceremony he had arranged. If something went wrong, if Gideon and Mercy needed to escape quickly, there would be people ready to help them disappear into the night. On June 15th, 2 days before the ceremony, to inspect the finished painting, Thomas came to the basement studio. The cloth that covered the large canvas he pulled back and looked at what Gideon had created. Magnificent it was. The founding fathers of Charleston, standing on the shore the scene depicted, looking out over the harbor as ships arrived from across the ocean. Rich and vibrant were the colors. Perfect was the composition. With lifelike precision every face was rendered. Exactly what the governor had ordered, it was exactly what Thomas had promised. Thomas smiled. On the shoulder, in a rare gesture of approval, he clapped Gideon. Throughout the entire South, this painting would make him famous. The crowning achievement of his career it would be, he said. In high spirits he left the studio, already imagining the praise he would receive. The second painting, hidden behind the larger canvas, he did not see. The look in Gideon's eyes as he watched Thomas leave he did not notice. The day of reckoning was approaching. On the morning of June 17, 1854, onto a wagon the painting was loaded and transported to Charleston under heavy guard. In layers of cloth, it was wrapped to protect it from the elements, and alongside it Thomas himself rode, anxious to ensure that nothing happened to his masterpiece. As always, Gideon was left behind at the plantation. To the ceremony he was not invited. In any way he was not acknowledged, but other arrangements Ezra Finch had made. That evening, as the sun began to set over Charleston, from the plantation Gideon slipped away. Nothing with him he carried, except the clothes on his back and a small cloth bag containing his secret painting, carefully rolled to protect it from damage. With him Mercy was, holding his hand tightly, as through the woods they made their way to a meeting point where a wagon waited. Samuel was the driver, a free black man who made his living transporting goods between plantations. A conductor on the Underground Railroad he was also, and dozens of people escaped to freedom over the years he had helped. Questions he did not ask when Gideon and Mercy climbed into the back of his wagon. Simply he nodded and clicked his tongue to set the horses moving. Several hours took the journey to Charleston. On back roads they traveled to avoid being seen, and twice they stopped when Samuel spotted patrols in the distance. But by the time the stars appeared in the sky, the outskirts of the city they had reached. Like a palace, the Planters' Hotel was lit up. From every window lanterns hung, and into the street spilled the sound of music and laughter. The block carriages lined as wealthy guests arrived for the ceremony. Inside, over 200 people had gathered in the grand ballroom, where refreshments were being served and anticipation was building for the unveiling of Thomas Ashworth's masterpiece. At the front of the room the painting stood, covered by a large velvet curtain. Beside it Thomas stood, accepting congratulations from admirers who had not yet even seen the work. In his finest suit he was dressed, his hair perfectly combed, his smile wide and confident. That at that very moment his entire world was about to collapse he had no idea. In the crowd Ezra Finch was dressed as a server. A uniform from an ally who worked at the hotel he had obtained, and through the room he moved carrying a tray of champagne glasses, his eyes scanning for the moment when the plan would be set in motion. At exactly 1800, to a small podium beside the covered painting stepped the governor of South Carolina. Silent fell the room. A short speech about the importance of art in celebrating Southern culture and heritage he gave. As the example of young Southern talent, he praised Thomas Ashworth, a credit to his family and his state. Then for the cord that would pull back the velvet curtain and reveal the painting to the assembled guests, he reached. The cord he pulled. Away fell the curtain, and for a moment that seemed to last forever, no sound in that room made anyone. Not the one Thomas had inspected 2 days earlier was the painting they saw. Not the grand historical scene depicting the founding of Charleston it was. Something else entirely it was. From the canvas a young black man stared out, his eyes fierce and unyielding. Like a weapon he held a brush in his hand. Behind him, flames consumed a plantation, and throughout the painting, hidden in the smoke and shadows, were dozens of faces. The faces of the enslaved, the forgotten, the erased. In the corner of the painting, clearly visible to everyone in the room, was a single word, Gideon. Like a wave the silence broke. To murmur people began, then to shout. Frozen stood Thomas Ashworth, his face draining of color as at the painting that had somehow replaced his own he stared. Back stepped the governor, confusion written across his features. Their mouths women gasped and covered. Explanations men demanded that no one could give. And in the back of the room, unseen by anyone who mattered, Ezra Finch smiled. The chaos that erupted in the grand ballroom of the Planters Hotel on the night of June 17, 1854, would be talked about in Charleston for decades. But in those first moments after the curtain fell, time itself seemed to slow down. Every person in that room was frozen, their minds struggling to make sense of what their eyes were showing them. Thomas Ashworth was the first to move. Toward the painting he lunged, his hands reaching out as if to tear it from the easel. But before he could touch the canvas, 2 men his arms grabbed and held him back. Friends of his father they were, men who had known Thomas since he was a child. What was happening they did not understand, but that destroying the painting in front of the governor and 200 witnesses would only make things worse they understood. Against their grip Thomas struggled, his face twisted with rage and fear. That this was not his painting he shouted, that someone had switched them, that a terrible mistake there had been. But even as the words left his mouth, that no one believed him he could see, clearly the painting in front of them was the work of the same hand that had created all of Thomas's previous pieces. Identical was the brushwork. The same was the use of color. Unmistakable was the technical skill. The subject matter was the only difference, and the signature in the corner. At the podium Governor James Hopkins stood, his prepared remarks about Southern culture and artistic achievement still clutched in his hand. A politician he was, a man who had spent his career navigating difficult situations. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. From the painting to Thomas to the confused faces of his guests he looked, and a decision he made. For order he called. Loud and commanding was his voice, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. In the room the murmuring subsided, though entirely it did not disappear. That some kind of confusion there had clearly been the governor announced, and that while the matter was investigated, the evening's program would be suspended. To remain calm he asked everyone and to enjoy the refreshments while he and a few trusted advisors sorted out what had happened. A reasonable response to an unreasonable situation it was, but to contain the damage it came too late. Among the guests that evening were 3 newspaper reporters. To cover what was supposed to be a celebration of Southern art and culture they had been invited. Instead, to something far more newsworthy they found themselves witnesses. One of them, a young man named William Porter, who worked for the Charleston Mercury, near the front of the room had been standing when the curtain fell. Everything clearly he had seen. The painting he had seen, and Thomas Ashworth's reaction he had seen, and in his head already he had begun composing his story, while the governor attempted to restore order. Through a side door, Porter slipped out of the ballroom. To the Mercury's offices on Broad Street he made his way, where he spent the next 3 hours writing the article that would appear in the morning edition. Ashworth Painting Scandal Rocks Governor's Gala would read the headline. The mysterious painting the story would describe, the name signed in the corner, and the obvious distress of the young artist who had supposedly created it. Questions that demanded answers it would ask, but the real story was still unfolding back at the hotel. To a private room on the second floor Thomas had been taken, away from the prying eyes of the guests. From the plantation his father, Cornelius, had been summoned and within a few hours was expected to arrive. In the meantime, back and forth like a caged animal Thomas paced, his mind racing through the possibilities. How had this happened? Himself, just 2 days earlier, he had inspected the painting. The Charleston founding scene it had been, exactly as he had ordered. Completely different was the painting that now hung in the ballroom. Someone had switched them. But who and how? Under guard, during the entire journey from the plantation to the hotel the painting had been. Without being seen, no one could have accessed it, unless before the painting left the plantation the switch had happened. Pacing, Thomas stopped, widened his eyes as the realization hit him. Gideon. It had to be Gideon. 2 paintings the boy must have created and somehow hidden the second one inside the first, or after Thomas's inspection, a way to replace the canvas he had found. However he had done it, for this disaster Gideon was responsible. A cold fury over Thomas settled. Everything to that boy he had given. He had protected him, provided for him, from the harsh realities of plantation life, kept him safe. And with public humiliation, this was how he was repaid. With the destruction of everything Thomas had built. For his personal servant Thomas called, a man named James who had accompanied him to Charleston. Specific instructions he gave James. Back to the plantation immediately, ride and find Gideon. Out of your sight, do not let him. When Cornelius arrives, what has happened tell him, and to bring Gideon to Charleston ask him. The boy himself Thomas would deal with. Immediately James left, pushing his horse hard through the night. But when at the Ashworth plantation, just before dawn he arrived, that Gideon was gone he discovered. Gone also was the young girl called Mercy. Their beds had not been slept in. Where they had gone no one in the quarters knew, or if they knew they were not saying. The hunt began. Meanwhile, miles away Gideon and Mercy were hidden in the back of a wagon that north along roads that few travelers used was making its way. Samuel, the driver, for years escaped slaves along this road, had been moving. Every safe house he knew, every sympathetic farmer, every hidden path through the woods, how to avoid the patrols that searched for runaways and the bounty hunters who made their living capturing them, he knew. For the first several hours of the journey, Gideon did not speak. In the darkness of the covered wagon he sat, holding Mercy close, over and over his mind, replaying the events of the evening. There to see the painting unveiled he had not been. Thomas's reaction he had not witnessed, or the confusion of the guests, but imagine it he could. For months about this moment he had thought, picturing how it would unfold, wondering if his plan would actually work. Now it had worked. Out in the world the painting was. For everyone to see his name was signed on it. Revealed had been the truth, at least partially. But that the revelation was only the beginning Gideon knew. What came next would determine whether any of it mattered. Against his shoulder, Mercy fell asleep, exhausted from the stress and the long journey. 8 years old now, she was too young to fully understand what was happening, but the danger they were in old enough to sense. That they were going somewhere safe, Gideon had explained to her. Somewhere far away where no one could hurt them. About the painting or the ceremony or the revenge he had planned for years, he had not told her. Burdens too heavy for a child to carry those were. As through the darkness the wagon rolled on, about the future for the first time in his life, Gideon allowed himself to think. In all his years on the plantation, a life beyond its boundaries he had never imagined. A closed door, the future had always been, something that for other people existed but not for him. Now opening was that door, just a crack, and light on the other side he could see. About what he would do if he made it to freedom, he thought. Paint he would, of course. Art that was truly his own he would create, with his own name, art that he could sign and to the world show. But teach he would also. Other children like himself he would find. Children whose gifts by the circumstances of their birth had been buried. And what they were capable of he would help them discover. These were the dreams that through the long night journey sustained him. The stars he navigated by they were, when the path ahead seemed impossible. Back in Charleston, new revelations the morning brought. By thousands of people over their breakfast tables, William Porter's article in the Mercury was read. Quickly the story spread, from person to person, passed, in drawing rooms and on street corners discussed. By noon, to the offices of newspapers in Columbia, Savannah, and Richmond it had reached. By evening, abbreviated versions of the story telegraph wires were carrying to New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Very different from the reaction in the South was the reaction in the North. Northern newspapers, particularly those with abolitionist sympathies, as evidence of the corruption at the heart of the slave system, seized on the story. Here was a young enslaved person of obvious genius, forced to create art that a white man claimed as his own. Exploitation in its purest form it was. Not just of labor, the theft, but of creativity and identity, they argued. A different approach Southern newspapers took. The validity of the story they questioned, suggesting that it was a hoax designed to embarrass the South. That no one had actually seen this mysterious Gideon create anything, they pointed out. Nothing the painting itself, they argued, proved. A name on a canvas anyone could sign. The work of Northern agitators trying to stir up trouble probably was the whole affair. But there were also Southerners who believed the story, or at least that it might be true, suspected. These were people who Thomas Ashworth's paintings had seen and had always sensed something slightly off about them. Technically brilliant the work was, but the passion and personality that usually marked a true artist it lacked. Why the paintings had not come from Thomas's heart, now they understood. Because from Thomas at all, they had not come. The day after the ceremony, Cornelius Ashworth arrived in Charleston, his face grim and his temper barely contained. Over decades of careful management and political maneuvering, he had built his reputation, now the center of a scandal that threatened to destroy everything his son had become. The family name, which throughout the state had commanded respect, suddenly of ridicule and suspicion a subject was. With his son in the private room at the Planters Hotel, Cornelius met. The conversation that followed was not recorded, but by the door servants who passed by reported hearing raised voices and the sound of furniture being overturned. When an hour later Cornelius emerged, pale was his face and his hands were shaking. To any of the reporters who had gathered outside the hotel, he refused to speak, passed them without a word, pushing. Later that day, through his lawyer, a public statement Cornelius issued. That the painting displayed at the governor's ceremony was not the one that had been commissioned, the statement acknowledged. That by unknown parties, possibly abolitionists, seeking to embarrass the Ashworth family and undermine Southern institutions, the painting had been switched, it suggested. Of Gideon or any enslaved person it made no mention. A full investigation it promised, and until all the facts were known asked the public to withhold judgment. No one the statement satisfied. As a cover-up, critics in the North dismissed it. Evasive and unconvincing supporters in the South found it, and those who had begun to suspect the truth as confirmation of their suspicions saw it. Thorough but ultimately inconclusive was the investigation that followed. Servants at the plantation, investigators interviewed, workers at the hotel, and everyone who had been involved in transporting the painting from one location to the other. That during transit the painting had been switched, they found no evidence. Too tight had been the security, too vigilant the guards. That before the painting left the plantation the switch had occurred was the only explanation that made sense. To the basement studio where Thomas had claimed to work this led the investigators. What they found there was revealing. For serious artistic work clearly set up was the room, with professional equipment and supplies that a small fortune must have cost. But no personal touches there were, no sketches or studies that would indicate an artist's process. Most tellingly, on any of Thomas's clothing no paint stains there were. No trace of pigment under his fingernails. For someone who supposedly spent hours every day painting, remarkably clean he was. With other enslaved people on the plantation, the investigators also spoke. Anything most refused to say, too afraid of the consequences to speak. But one person did talk. Cora was her name. 73 years old now she was. The woman who from infancy had raised Gideon after his mother died. Him grow up she had watched, had seen his gift emerge. To keep it hidden had warned him. Thomas's discovery of the boy's talent and the arrangement that followed she had witnessed. And for 3 years silent she had kept, bound by fear and the need to protect the child she loved. But gone now Gideon was. He had escaped, had made it out, for the whole world to see, had exposed the truth. And too old and too tired to be afraid anymore Cora was. Everything she told the investigators. About Gideon's drawings behind the smokehouse she told them. About Thomas finding the boy and forcing him to work in secret she told them. About the hundreds of hours Gideon had spent in that basement creating paintings that Thomas claimed as his own she told them. About the threats against mercy, the constant fear, the stolen credit, and the stolen years she told them. When she finished, for a long moment in silence sat the lead investigator. A Southerner he was, a man who in the rightness of the system that held people like Cora in bondage had grown up believing. But a man who valued truth he was also. And the truth he had just heard, something loose inside him shook. 2 weeks after the ceremony to the governor, the investigator's report was submitted. What many had suspected it confirmed. By an enslaved person named Gideon had been created the paintings attributed to Thomas Ashworth, who under threat of violence had been coerced into working. That Thomas be censured, and that his previous works be reattributed to their true creator, the report recommended. Never made public was the report. Once Governor Hopkins read it, then in a drawer in his desk locked it. Too dangerous were the political implications, too unpredictable the social consequences. If public became the report, to abolitionists across the country ammunition it would provide. The carefully constructed argument that enslaved people were incapable of higher thought or artistic achievement. It would undermine. About how many other talents were being suppressed, How many other geniuses were being forced to work in anonymity? It would raise questions. That happened the governor could not allow. So hidden stayed the report, and that the affair was a hoax perpetrated by outside agitators remained the official position. But a way of spreading has the truth, even when powerful people try to contain it. In the weeks that followed, through unofficial channels more details emerged. Newspaper reporters continued to investigate, particularly in the North, where editors were eager to publish anything that reflected badly on the slave system. With observations that suddenly made sense, former visitors to the Ashworth plantation came forward: the paint, free hands, the vague answers about artistic process, the way Thomas always changed the subject when asked about specific techniques. And then there were the people in the quarters. From a distance, the enslaved people of the Ashworth plantation had watched the drama unfold. The investigators come and go they had seen, about what Cora had told them, rumors they had heard, and a decision they had made. Buried be Gideon's story they would not let. One by one, with anyone who would listen what they knew, they began to share. Fragments of the story traveling preachers who visited the plantation heard, and to other plantations carried it. Whispers merchants who came to trade heard, and in towns throughout the county repeated them. To other farms, enslaved people who were hired out spread the word to their new communities. Within a month, throughout the South, known was the story of Gideon, the enslaved artist whose work by his master's son had been stolen. In different versions with different details it was told, but the same remained the core of the story. With extraordinary talent, a black child had been gifted. For his own glory, a white man had exploited that talent, and in the end, in the most dramatic way possible, revealed had been the truth. For the people in the quarters, a symbol Gideon became. The countless talents that had been suppressed he represented. The countless achievements that had been stolen. The countless lives that, by a system designed to treat human beings as property, had been diminished. That someday the truth about all of them would be known. His story gave them hope. In the aftermath of the scandal, well, Thomas Ashworth did not fare. His reputation, which entirely on work that was not his own had been built, completely collapsed. From their walls, the galleries that had displayed his paintings quietly removed them. That they had never heard of him, pretended the critics who had praised his genius. On their guest lists, suddenly no room had the society families who had welcomed him into their homes. To continue painting, Thomas tried. To prove that talent of his own he had, but mediocre at best was the work he produced, lacking the spark that his previous paintings so remarkable had made. To galleries under a false name he submitted pieces, hoping for an honest evaluation, and every time was rejected. Him destroyed the failure. Within a year, a serious drinking problem Thomas had developed. His days locked in his room he spent, surrounded by half-finished canvases and empty bottles. Doctors and advisors his father tried to send to help, but nothing worked. His entire identity on being an artist Thomas had built, and now that he had never been one he knew. Like a cancer, the knowledge ate away at him. In the spring of 1856, for Europe, Thomas Ashworth boarded a ship bound. That he needed time away, he told his family, a chance to start fresh in a place where no one knew his name or his history. In a small town in southern France he settled, far from the art world that once had celebrated him. For the next 30 years there he lived, working odd jobs and slowly to death drinking himself. Never again he painted. Through careful political maneuvering and generous donations to the right causes, some of the family's reputation Cornelius Ashworth managed to salvage, but never fully lifted did the shadow of the scandal. When in 1861 he died, just as the Civil War was beginning, his business success and his political connections the obituaries mentioned. His son or the artist who in his basement had work they did not mention. And what of Gideon? Long and dangerous was the journey north, along a route that through 3 states past Samuel, the wagon driver, took Gideon and Mercy, stopping at safe houses operated by members of the Underground Railroad. Mostly at night they traveled, during the day hiding in barns, cellars, and sometimes in the woods when no shelter was available. Close calls there were. Once within 50 yards of where they were hiding, a patrol of slave catchers passed, and to cover Mercy's mouth Gideon had to keep her from crying out in fear. Another time, at a bridge by a deputy, they were stopped who asked to search the wagon. His way out of it Samuel talked, claiming to be transporting supplies for a church in the next county, but to run if necessary. Gideon had already prepared himself. After 2 weeks of travel, into Pennsylvania they crossed. Unlike anything he had experienced before was the relief Gideon felt when on free soil Samuel told him they were. His entire life about freedom he had heard, had dreamed about it, what it would feel like, had tried to imagine. But beyond anything he had imagined was the reality. Not just the absence of chains or overseers, it was the presence of possibility. It was the sense that his life was now his own to shape. North to Philadelphia they continued, where Ezra Finch was waiting for them. To the city immediately after the ceremony in Charleston Ezra had returned, knowing that if he stayed in the South too long he would be suspected. For Gideon and Mercy to stay with a Quaker family in the Germantown neighborhood he had arranged, a community for its anti-slavery sympathies and its willingness to help escaped slaves known. Morrison was the family's name. Jacob and Sarah Morrison, in their 50s, were childless and deeply committed to the abolitionist cause. Into their home, as if they were long-lost relatives, they welcomed Gideon and Mercy. Warm clothes and good food Sarah made sure they had. As an assistant at a local print shop, Jacob helped Gideon find work, where his artistic skills proved valuable. For the first time in his life, for his labor Gideon was paid. Actual money that he could spend as he pleased he received. By most standards a small amount it was, but to Gideon something priceless it represented. That his work had value, the acknowledgement that he had value. In his spare time he continued to paint. In the attic of the house, a small studio Jacob Morrison set up, equipping it with supplies that Ezra Finch helped to purchase. There, by the light of candles and oil lamps, the first works that were truly his own Gideon created. By anyone they were not commissioned, not for any particular purpose intended. Simply expressions of what he felt and what he had experienced they were. A portrait of his mother was the first painting he completed in freedom. From memory, for years Ruth's face he had been painting, ever since he was old enough to hold a brush. But different was this version. Larger it was, more detailed, more alive than anything he had created before. Not as a slave he painted her, but as a queen, with a dignity and grace that the institution of slavery could never diminish. When the painting he finished, on the wall of the attic studio he hung it. Every day before he began work, at it he would look and remember where he had come from. And every day his brush he would pick up and continue creating, knowing that what she would have wanted him to do he was doing. More easily than Gideon had expected to freedom Mercy adapted. Resilient children are, and young enough she was that the trauma of plantation life into permanent scars had not yet hardened. In a school for black children run by the African Methodist Episcopal Church, she enrolled. Where to read and write she learned, and that for mathematics she had a gift discovered. Like a grandmother to her, Sarah Morrison became, teaching her to cook and sew and navigate the world of free black society in Philadelphia. Mercy flourished. Gideon watched and felt a satisfaction that beyond anything his art had ever given him went. To protect her he had promised, and that promise he had kept. Whatever else in his life happened, that he would always have, throughout 1854 and 1855, continued to spread the story of the Charleston painting. Detailed accounts of the scandal Northern newspapers published, and into their lectures as an example of the injustices inherent in slavery, abolitionist speakers incorporated it. In a speech in Boston, the Case himself mentioned Frederick Douglass, calling Gideon's work a testament to the talent that slavery sought to suppress. From Philadelphia, these developments Gideon followed, reading every newspaper account he could find. A mixture of pride and frustration he felt. Pride that his story was being told, that about what had happened people were learning. Frustration that for himself he could not speak, could not step forward and claim the recognition he deserved. The problem was that technically a fugitive he still was. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, captured and returned to their owners could be escaped slaves, even in free states. For Gideon's return, Cornelius Ashworth had posted a reward, describing him as valuable property that had been stolen. If his location Gideon revealed, himself and everyone who had helped him at risk he would be putting. So in the shadows he remained, creating art that outside his small circle no one would see, waiting for the day when safe to step into the light it would be. Sooner than he expected came that day. In 1857, in Boston, a group of wealthy abolitionists an exhibition called Free, The Art of Freedom organized. The work of black artists, both free and formerly enslaved. To showcase designed was the exhibition, as a way of demonstrating the creative capacity that slavery sought to deny. To Ezra Finch, the organizers reached out, asking if any artists he knew of who might contribute. About Gideon, Ezra told them. Immediate and enthusiastic was the response. In the exhibition, Gideon's work the organizers wanted. More than that, Gideon himself they wanted. Protection to provide they promised, to hire lawyers who would challenge any attempt to capture him under the Fugitive Slave Act, to mobilize public opinion in his defense if necessary. A risk it was, a significant risk, but to take it Gideon decided. In October of 1857, into the Boston Athenaeum where The Art of Freedom was being held walked Gideon Vance. 20 years old he was, a tall young man with serious eyes and paint-stained hands. A suit that the Morrisons had bought for him he wore, the first suit he had ever owned, and on the walls of the gallery hung 12 of his paintings, each one with his name signed. A sensation was the exhibition. For its technical skill and emotional depth, critics praised the work. At the range of subjects, visitors marveled. Landscapes, portraits, historical scenes, all with a mastery that for someone so young seemed impossible rendered. And when the story behind the paintings they learned, the story of the enslaved boy who for years in secret had been forced to work, only grew their admiration. To newspapers and magazines Gideon gave interviews. At abolitionist meetings and church gatherings he spoke. Again and again his story he told, not for his own glory, but for all the others whose stories never would be told. Of what was possible when talent was allowed to flourish, a symbol he became, and of what was lost when it was suppressed, a reminder that the organizers had feared never materialized the legal challenges. The previous year, Cornelius Ashworth had died, and in disarray was his estate. The time and money required to pursue a fugitive slave claim in a hostile northern court, no one was willing to invest. For all practical purposes, free Gideon was. His freedom wisely he used. From the sale of his paintings with money earned, for black children a small art school in Philadelphia he established. Out of a rented building in the Northern Liberties neighborhood the school operated, free instruction to anyone who wanted to learn offering. Many of the classes himself Gideon taught, passing on the techniques during all those years in the basement studio he had developed. A success the school was. Within a few years, several notable artists it had produced who onto careers of their own went. For their achievements no credit Gideon took, insisting that all along the talent had been there, waiting to be discovered. The opportunity that he himself had been denied simply he was providing. In 1861, the Civil War began. With a mixture of hope and dread the conflict unfold Gideon watched. Hope that the institution that had shaped his life, finally the war would end. Dread for the suffering he knew it would cause. For the lives that before the fighting was done would be lost. When in January of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued to commemorate the moment a painting Gideon created. A group of enslaved people looking up at the sky. It showed where in letters of gold the words of the proclamation were written. A range of emotions their faces expressed, joy, disbelief, relief, and a cautious hope. One of the most powerful images he ever created it was, and widely throughout the North in newspapers and magazines it was reproduced. In April of 1865, the war ended. Abolished was slavery, and Gideon Vance at 25 years old, truly free, at last was. In Philadelphia he could have stayed, could have continued to build his reputation as an artist and teacher. To celebrate him eager was the art world, to claim him as one of their own. But something stronger than fame or success Gideon felt the pull of. Back to South Carolina he went. Very different from his escape 11 years earlier was the journey south. By train he traveled, sitting in the colored car, but openly traveling without fear of capture. Change as he moved from the industrial north to the devastated south he watched the landscape, seeing the ruins of a world that once permanent had seemed. Almost unrecognizable was the Ashworth plantation. During the war burned had been the big house, and only its brick foundations remained. Overgrown were the fields. Collapsed the outbuildings. Empty were the quarters where Gideon had grown up, their former residents scattered across the country. What he was looking for in a small cemetery at the edge of the property Gideon found. For the enslaved people who had lived and died on the plantation, the burial ground it was, by simple wooden crosses that mostly rotted away marked. Among the unmarked graves he searched until the one he was looking for he found. Ruth, his mother, here 25 years ago in an unmarked grave that no one had tended, she had been buried. In the dirt Gideon knelt and wept. For the mother he had never known he wept. For the father he would never meet. For the childhood that from him had been stolen. For all the years of secrecy and fear he wept, all the paintings with another man's name signed, all the talent that to glorify a system that treated him as property had been used. And when no more tears he had, from Philadelphia a small painting that he had brought with him he took out. The portrait of Ruth that in his attic studio hung it was the one in the first months of his freedom he had created. A smaller copy to leave at her grave he had made, a gift that in life he should have been able to give her. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile the painting showed. From her back wings emerged, lifting her toward a sky filled with stars, and at the bottom a single line Gideon had written, "You gave me these hands. I painted freedom." On the grave the painting he placed, and with a flat stone to protect it from the elements covered it. Then he stood and looked around at the ruined plantation, the collapsed buildings, the overgrown fields. Everything that once so powerful, so permanent, so indestructible had seemed now just rubble and weeds was. But still here Gideon was. Still here his art was. Still being told his story was. Fallen had the masters. In their place risen had the truth. To Philadelphia Gideon returned, and for another 40 years continued his work. Thousands of canvases he painted, hundreds of students taught, and one of the most respected artists of his generation became. In museums across the country, his work is now held, each piece with the name he had claimed for himself on that night in Charleston signed. In 1870 he married a woman named Elizabeth, who a teacher at his school had been. 3 children they had, all of whom to adulthood survived. Close to the family Mercy stayed, eventually a mathematics teacher herself, becoming and helping to run the school's administrative affairs. In 1905, at the age of 65, Gideon died. One of the great American artists of the 19th century, his obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer called him, and noted that his early work created in slavery demonstrated the indomitable nature of human genius. At his funeral, a passage that late in his life Gideon had written his oldest son read. About art or fame or the scandal that had made him famous it was not. About something simpler and more profound it was. Everything from me they took, Gideon had written. My mother and my father they took. My childhood and my freedom they took. My work they took and another man's name on it put. My soul they tried to take. But one thing there was they could never take. The truth of who I was they could never take. The vision in my eyes or the skill in my hands they could never take. The fire that inside me burned they could never take. For 17 years a slave I was. But from the moment I was born an artist I was. And until the moment I die an artist I will be. That is the one thing from me they could never steal. That is the one thing that always mine was. Complicated one is not the lesson of Gideon Vance's life. Simply this it is, human beings are more than the circumstances of their birth. Talent, genius, creativity, these things about skin color or social status do not care. Wherever they will they emerge, in the most unexpected places and the most unlikely people. For 2.5 centuries, this truth the institution of slavery tried to deny. That black people were inferior, incapable of higher thought or refined creativity, it tried to convince the world. From law to religion to violence, every tool at its disposal it used to enforce this lie. But never true was the lie, and people like Gideon Vance proved it was a lie every time they picked up a brush, or a pen, or an instrument. In the spirituals they sang and the stories they told they proved it. In the resistance they mounted, and the escapes they engineered they proved it. Simply by surviving they proved it, by maintaining their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Violent was not Gideon's revenge. Down the plantation he did not burn or harm the people who had harmed him. More powerful and more lasting his revenge was something. The truth was his revenge. A painting that could not be denied he created. His name where the world could see it he signed. The people who from him had stolen to confront what they had done he forced. And in doing so, something that no one could ever take away, he claimed. His identity, his legacy, his place in history. Forgotten now is the Ashworth family. In obscurity Thomas died, and his paintings, the ones he actually created himself, worthless are considered. A ruin is the plantation, visited occasionally by historians, but otherwise to the weeds and the weather abandoned. But remembered is Gideon Vance. In museums his paintings hang. In schools his story is taught. His name, the name he signed on that fateful night in Charleston, to millions of people who have never heard of the Ashworths or their plantation is known. That is the truest revenge of all. Not violence, not destruction, but survival. Not hatred, but creation. Not the defeat of enemies, but the triumph of truth. This better than anyone Gideon understood. That the brush in his hand was more powerful than any weapon he understood. That the images he created would outlast the chains that bound him he understood. That art, true art, is an act of resistance that no oppressor can overcome he understood. To own him they tried. To silence him they tried. His gift to steal and claim it as their own they tried. But in the end, To freedom Gideon Vance painted his way, and no one then or now has ever been able to explain how a boy with no training and no resources created works that rivaled the masters. Maybe no explanation there is. Maybe some gifts are too powerful to be contained, too bright to be hidden, too true to be denied. Maybe simply proof that the human spirit cannot be chained was Gideon.